March 1994. An 18-year-old college freshman disappears after leaving a campus house to meet friends. The next day, her body is found in a field, brutally attacked, raped, murdered. Police recover DNA from the crime scene. They interview 75 suspects, all eliminated. The killer vanishes. For 12 years, her family lived without answers. Her murderer walked free. And then, in 2006, something extraordinary happened, not because of brilliant detective work or a lucky break, but because of a single law that changed everything. This is the story of Stephanie Hummer, and how a convicted felon's failure to pay child support finally solved a cold case that had haunted an entire community. But it's also a story about the evolution of forensic science, the difficult balance between privacy and justice, and the hidden costs that come with solving crimes that have gone cold for over a decade. Stephanie Hummer was a freshman at Ohio State University, a bright young woman from suburban Cincinnati, a graduate of Finneytown High School with her whole life ahead of her. By all accounts, she was the kind of person who lit up a room, who helped others, who embodied the optimism and promise of youth. On that March evening in 1994, she left the Evans Scholar House to meet friends. Nothing unusual, just another night in the life of a college student navigating the excitement and independence of university life. But Stephanie briefly returned to help an injured friend, a small act of kindness that would prove tragically consequential. After that, she disappeared. The following morning, her partially clothed body was discovered in a field off River Street on the west side of Columbus. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. She had been raped and killed from a blow to the head. The violence was extreme, senseless, incomprehensible. This wasn't a random accident or a tragic misunderstanding. This was a brutal, predatory attack that ended a young life with callous disregard. The Ohio State campus was shaken to its core. Students who had felt safe walking to classes, to parties, to late-night study sessions suddenly felt vulnerable. Parents across the state questioned whether their children were safe at university. The sense of violation extended far beyond Stephanie's immediate circle. It touched everyone who considered OSU their community. University officials, the president, trustees, administrators, immediately committed to aggressive safety improvements. They didn't just offer thoughts and prayers. They restructured campus security protocols, enhanced lighting in dark areas, coordinated joint patrols with Columbus Police, and invested heavily in crime prevention programs and personal safety education. 2 trustees even offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, a substantial sum in 1994, signaling just how seriously the university took this tragedy. But despite the community's determination, despite the DNA evidence collected at the scene, despite the immediate and exhaustive investigation, the case went cold almost immediately. Here's what makes this case so frustrating, so emblematic of the limitations facing law enforcement in the mid-1990s. The police did everything right. They recovered a DNA sample from the crime scene, clear, usable, properly preserved evidence that captured the perpetrator's genetic profile from the sexual assault. They interviewed over 75 people in the immediate aftermath. They followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. They eliminated suspects methodically, carefully, professionally. But in 1994, forensic technology existed in a vastly different landscape than it does today. DNA analysis was still relatively new. The methods being used, restriction fragment length polymorphism or RFLP, and the earliest iterations of short tandem repeat analysis, were sophisticated for their time but required significant sample quantities and processing time. More critically, the infrastructure to compare DNA profiles across cases and jurisdictions was virtually non-existent. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, had just been established by Congress in 1994, the same year Stephanie was murdered. The databases were tiny, disconnected, primitive by today's standards. States were just beginning to mandate DNA collection from convicted offenders, and even then only from the most serious violent criminals. The national network of genetic profiles that we take for granted today was still years away from maturity. So the investigators had the killer's genetic fingerprint. They had irrefutable biological evidence. They just had no one to match it to. The perpetrator wasn't in their suspect pool. He wasn't in any database. He might as well have been a ghost. For Stephanie's parents, Sue and Dan Hummer, the years that followed were an unimaginable ordeal. The grief of losing a child is devastating enough. But to lose a child to violence, to murder, and then to have no answers, no closure, no one held accountable, that's a special kind of torture that most people can't comprehend. They channeled their grief into something constructive. In 1998, 4 years after Stephanie's murder, and with the case still unsolved, they helped establish the Stephanie Hummer Recreation Park. What had been an ugly parking lot was transformed into a welcoming playground and community gathering place where children could laugh and play. They planted a tree in her name, fulfilling a wish from a poem Stephanie herself had written called When I Am Gone, where she'd expressed the hope that a tree would grow amidst the laughter of playful children. The Hummers said that this 3-year project was instrumental in helping them manage their grief, in giving them something positive to focus on when the investigation seemed hopelessly stalled. The park stands not just as a memorial to Stephanie's memory, but as a tangible representation of how a community can transform irreversible loss into something that serves others, something that honors life rather than dwelling only on death. But the question never left them. Who killed our daughter? And as the years turned into a decade, that question seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. In 2003, something seemingly unrelated happened. A 33-year-old man named Jonathan Gravely was convicted of a felony in Ohio, failure to pay child support. Now, this is important to understand. Failure to pay child support is classified as a felony in Ohio, but it's fundamentally a non-violent, administrative offense. It's the kind of crime that reflects poor financial management or personal irresponsibility, not violence, not predatory behavior, nothing that would flag someone as dangerous to the community. Under the DNA collection laws that existed at that time, Gravely wouldn't have been required to submit a DNA sample. The system was designed around a reasonable but ultimately flawed assumption that the people most likely to commit future violent crimes were those who had already demonstrated violent tendencies. So the databases focused on collecting DNA from violent offenders, sex offenders, murderers, people whose criminal history suggested they posed a clear and present danger. Jonathan Gravely didn't fit that profile. He paid his debt to society for the child support violation and moved on with his life, his genetic profile remaining unknown to law enforcement, his connection to an unsolved murder from 9 years earlier completely invisible to the system. But then came 2005 and everything changed. That year, the Ohio General Assembly passed a groundbreaking and controversial law. Every convicted felon, regardless of the type of crime, would be required to submit DNA to the state database. Not just murderers, not just rapists, not just violent offenders. Every single person convicted of a felony offense would have their genetic profile entered into the system. This expansion was codified in the Ohio Revised Code sections governing DNA laboratories and databases. It represented a fundamental shift in criminal justice philosophy, from targeted collection based on offense type to universal collection based on felony conviction status. The debate was fierce. Civil liberties advocates argued it was an invasion of privacy, an overreach of state power, a violation of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. They pointed out that genetic information is uniquely personal, uniquely identifying, and potentially subject to abuse. They worried about racial disparities in felony convictions translating into racial disparities in database enrollment. They questioned whether people convicted of nonviolent, administrative crimes should have their most intimate biological information permanently stored in government databases. But lawmakers and law enforcement officials believed the expansion would dramatically increase the power of forensic databases to solve cold cases and identify serial offenders who might have started with minor crimes before escalating to violence. They argued that individuals convicted of felonies had already surrendered certain privacy rights through their criminal conduct, and that the state's compelling interest in solving violent crimes and protecting public safety outweighed those privacy concerns. The policy analysts and legislators who championed this law believed it would work. They believed it would solve cases that conventional investigation couldn't crack. But they had no idea they were about to validate their entire theory with a case that would become the textbook example cited in forensic policy debates for decades to come. In 2005, under the new law, Jonathan Gravely's probation officer collected his DNA sample. It was a routine administrative procedure, just another requirement of his post-conviction supervision. The sample was processed, his genetic profile was generated, and it was uploaded to Ohio's database and run through Cody's. And suddenly, after 12 silent years, the system lit up. Match. The DNA collected from Stephanie Hummer's body in 1994, the biological evidence recovered from the sexual assault, carefully preserved by investigators who believed it might someday lead to justice, matched the DNA of Jonathan Gravely, a 35-year-old man whose only conviction was for failing to pay child support. Imagine being the forensic analyst who saw that match appear on the screen. Imagine being the detective who got the call that a cold case, a brutal rape and murder that had haunted the department for over a decade, had suddenly broken wide open. Imagine being Stephanie's parents, receiving word after 12 years of silence that police finally had a name, a face, a suspect who could be arrested and charged. In January 2006, Columbus police arrested Jonathan Gravely and charged him with Stephanie Hummer's murder. Franklin County prosecutor Ron O'Brien was remarkably candid in his public statements. Without that DNA sample, without the 2005 law requiring collection from all felons, this case would likely never have been solved. The 75 suspects interviewed in 1994 hadn't included Gravely. The conventional investigation, interviews, witness statements following tips, had reached a dead end years earlier. There was no path from traditional detective work to Jonathan Gravely. Only the DNA connected him to the crime, and only the 2005 law put his DNA in the system. Following the irrefutable DNA match, Gravely eventually confessed to the crime. Now, this sequence is crucial from both a legal and ethical standpoint. The forensic evidence came first, the confession second. This protected against the possibility of a false confession, a phenomenon that research shows accounts for roughly 30% of wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA evidence. False confessions happen more often than most people realize. They fall into three categories: voluntary false confessions, where individuals confess for psychological reasons like a need for attention; compliant false confessions, where suspects confess to escape the stress of interrogation even though they know they're innocent; and persuaded false confessions, where prolonged interrogation actually convinces innocent people that they might have committed the crime. By establishing the DNA match first, investigators ensured that Gravely's confession wasn't the product of coercion, suggestion, or psychological manipulation. The science was ironclad before anyone ever spoke to him. There was no ambiguity here, no room for doubt, no possibility that this was a wrongful conviction based on unreliable testimonial evidence. The genetic evidence didn't just point to Gravely, it proved, with scientific certainty approaching absolute, that he was Stephanie Hummer's killer. In October 2007, 13.5 years after Stephanie's murder, Jonathan Gravely, now 37 years old, stood in Franklin County Court and pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and kidnapping. The plea agreement was strategic on both sides. For Gravely, the primary motivation was avoiding the death penalty. Ohio is a capital punishment state, and the circumstances of Stephanie's murder, the kidnapping, the sexual assault, the extreme violence, would have made this a death penalty eligible case if it had gone to trial. Even defendants with overwhelming evidence against them often accept plea deals to avoid the ultimate punishment. The difference between life in prison and execution is profound enough to make a guilty plea the rational choice, even when it means admitting to horrific crimes. For prosecutors, the plea agreement offered certainty. Capital trials are extraordinarily expensive, lengthy, and subject to years of appeals. By securing a guilty plea, they guaranteed a conviction without the risk of a jury verdict being overturned on technical grounds, without the emotional toll of a trial on Stephanie's family, and without the possibility, however remote, of an acquittal. As part of the agreement, prosecutors dropped the separate rape charge against Gravely. This wasn't because the rape didn't happen, the DNA evidence conclusively proved the sexual assault, but as a procedural concession to secure the guaranteed conviction for aggravated murder and kidnapping. In practical terms, it made no difference to the sentence, but it simplified the legal proceedings and eliminated potential grounds for appeal. Gravely was sentenced to an aggregate term of 25 years to life in prison. The official records from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction break this down precisely. 20 years to life for aggravated murder, plus 5 to 25 years for kidnapping, served consecutively. After credits for the 622 days, approximately 1.7 years, that he'd spent in jail awaiting trial and sentencing. His official parole eligibility date was set for April 1, 2033. Let that sink in for a moment. April 1, 2033. That's when the Ohio Parole Board will conduct its first full review of Jonathan Gravely's case and determine whether he should be released. When the sentence was announced, the reaction from Stephanie's family revealed the complex, unsatisfying nature of delayed justice. Her father, Dan Hummer, said it was too little, too late. Prosecutor O'Brien acknowledged that while justice had finally been served, Stephanie's parents had been devastated for 13 and a half years. And her mother said they would live with it for the rest of our lives. These aren't just sound bites. They're the articulation of a profound truth about cold case resolution. Justice delayed is not the same as justice served. For 13 and a half years, the Hummers lived with the knowledge that their daughter's killer was walking free, possibly living nearby, possibly passing them on the street. They lived with the absence of accountability, the absence of answers, the gnawing uncertainty of whether the case would ever be solved. And then, when it finally was solved, when the person responsible was finally held accountable, it couldn't undo the decade-plus of anguish they'd endured, couldn't restore Stephanie to life, couldn't give them back the years they'd spent in limbo. Sue Hummer passed away in 2015, 8 years after Gravely's conviction and 18 years before his earliest possible parole date. She died having seen her daughter's killer brought to justice, but she also died knowing he might someday be released. Here's something most people don't consider when they hear about cold cases being solved. For families like the Hummers, the conviction doesn't end the trauma. Jonathan Gravely's sentence, life with the possibility of parole, means that every few years the family must relive their nightmare. They must appear at parole hearings. They must present victim impact statements. They must advocate for his continued incarceration. They must face him again and again, describing their loss, arguing that he shouldn't be released, reliving the worst moment of their lives on a mandated schedule. Stephanie's murder becomes a wound that can never fully heal because the system requires it to be reopened periodically. This is the paradox of indeterminate sentencing. Justice is served in the sense that the perpetrator is held accountable, but closure remains forever out of reach because the possibility of release creates an ongoing obligation for victims' families to participate in the criminal justice process indefinitely. Some victims' advocates argue that life sentences with parole eligibility should be reconsidered precisely because of this systemic imposition of recurring trauma. Others argue that parole systems exist for good reasons, that people can change, that redemption is possible, that sentences should be proportional and allow for the possibility of rehabilitation. These are difficult moral and policy questions without easy answers. What's indisputable is that for the Hummer family, April 2033 isn't a date of closure. It's the beginning of another chapter in a story that will never truly end. The Stephanie Hummer case has become a cornerstone argument in debates about DNA collection laws, cited in legislative hearings, academic papers, and policy discussions across the country. Here was a brutal rape and murder, a case that devastated a community, traumatized a university campus, and haunted investigators for over a decade. And it was solved not by a violent criminal's DNA, not by a sex offender's profile, but by a non-violent felon convicted of failing to pay child support. This single case demonstrates what policy analysts and economists call enormous returns to scale in DNA databases. Unlike most law enforcement interventions, which show diminishing returns as they expand, DNA databases actually become dramatically more effective as they grow larger. Every additional profile exponentially increases the likelihood of matches in cold cases and ongoing investigations. The power of CODIs isn't in punishing criminals more severely. It's in dramatically increasing the probability that perpetrators are identified, even years later, even when their connection to the crime isn't obvious through conventional investigation. The mechanism isn't about harsher sentences. It's about making the likelihood of being caught and held accountable approach certainty. The Hummer case proves that filtering database enrollment by offense type, while intuitively appealing as a way to balance privacy and public safety, is scientifically and practically counterproductive. Jonathan Gravely's failure to pay child support had no logical connection to his capacity for rape and murder. But his genetic profile, once in the system, became the key that unlocked a case that would otherwise have remained permanently unsolved. Research has consistently shown that DNA databases are substantially more cost-effective than conventional law enforcement strategies in reducing crime. A single solved cold case can prevent future crimes by removing a dangerous individual from society and by creating a deterrent effect when potential criminals understand that biological evidence creates a permanent, inescapable link between them and their crimes. But the ethical concerns raised by critics are real and deserve serious consideration. Expanding DNA collection to all felons, and especially the trend toward collecting samples upon arrest before conviction, does create risks. Genetic information is uniquely personal and potentially subject to abuse. There are legitimate Fourth Amendment concerns about the scope of government intrusion into citizens' biological privacy. There are valid worries about racial disparities in the criminal justice system being amplified in genetic databases. Ohio expanded its DNA collection law even further in 2011 with Senate Bill 77, which authorized collection upon felony arrest rather than waiting for conviction. This pushes the boundary even further, collecting genetic information from individuals who are legally presumed innocent. The justification is that DNA, unlike other forms of identification, can immediately exonerate innocent suspects and solve multiple cases quickly. But it also means that people who are never convicted, whose charges are dropped or who are acquitted at trial, have their genetic profiles entered into permanent government databases. These are not trivial concerns, and the Hummer case, despite its powerful demonstration of database effectiveness, doesn't resolve these ethical tensions. What it does do is force us to confront a difficult question. How many other Stephanie Hummers are out there? How many cold cases remain unsolved because the perpetrator's DNA isn't in the system? How many families are still waiting for answers that a broader database could provide? How many future crimes could be prevented by maximizing the deterrent and identificatory power of genetic databases? There's no perfect answer here. Every policy choice involves trade-offs. But the Hummer case has become the definitive real-world example of what's at stake in these debates. Not abstract principles, but actual human lives, actual families, actual justice that hangs in the balance based on legislative decisions about database breadth and collection criteria. Since the resolution of the Hummer case, forensic technology has continued to advance in remarkable ways. The DNA match that identified Gravely was achieved using traditional Cody's matching protocols based on short tandem repeat analysis, comparing the crime scene profile directly against offender profiles in the database looking for exact matches. But newer techniques have emerged for cases where standard Cody's searches fail. Familial DNA testing, for instance, searches databases for profiles that are similar but not identical to the crime scene sample, concentrating on Y chromosome markers that are inherited through male lineages. This can identify possible relatives of unknown perpetrators, a father, brother, or son whose DNA is in the system even if the actual criminal's isn't. Several high-profile cases have been solved by identifying a criminal through a family member's database profile. Even more revolutionary is investigative genetic genealogy, which uses genetic profiles uploaded to public databases by private citizens interested in genealogy and ancestry. By comparing crime scene DNA to these voluntary databases and constructing family trees, investigators can narrow down potential suspects even when no one in the criminal justice system has a matching profile. The Golden State Killer case, solved in 2018 after decades, is the most famous example of this technique. These advanced methods are more resource-intensive, ethically complex, and technically challenging than standard Cody's matching. But they demonstrate that forensic science continues to push the boundaries of what's possible in cold case investigation. Had the 2005 Ohio law failed to capture Jonathan Gravely, the Hummer case might have eventually become a candidate for these cutting-edge genetic genealogy approaches. The fact that it was solved through straightforward database expansion rather than these sophisticated techniques actually reinforces the policy argument. Maximizing traditional database enrollment is the most efficient, cost-effective path to resolving the vast majority of cold cases. Stephanie's murder changed more than just forensic policy and investigative techniques. It catalyzed genuine institutional reform at Ohio State University that extended far beyond the immediate crisis response. The university didn't just issue statements and implement temporary security measures. It fundamentally rethought campus safety, created sustained coordination mechanisms with Columbus Police, and invested in comprehensive crime prevention programs and personal safety education that continue to this day. The tragedy also sparked the creation of the Wineland Park Collaborative, a sustained partnership bringing together neighborhood residents, local institutions including OSU, Columbus Police, and area businesses to improve safety, housing, and overall quality of life in the communities surrounding campus. What began as a response to unspeakable violence became a multi-year, multi-stakeholder effort that strengthened an entire neighborhood's fabric. This kind of crisis-driven institutional change is significant because it demonstrates that communities can respond to tragedy not just with grief and fear, but with structural reforms that make genuine improvements in safety and quality of life. The Wineland Park Collaborative wasn't a temporary initiative or a public relations gesture. It was a fundamental reshaping of how the university and surrounding community collaborated on shared challenges. And in that playground, the Stephanie Hummer Recreation Park, children still play beneath the tree planted in her memory. Laughter fills the space where once there was only grief, only an ugly parking lot, only the weight of unanswered questions. It's not the ending anyone would have chosen, but it's the legacy her family worked to create. Something living, something good, something that honors who Stephanie was and what she represented, rather than being defined solely by how she died. The park represents a form of resilience that's distinct from closure. It doesn't erase the tragedy. It doesn't make the loss acceptable, but it transforms that loss into something that serves others, that creates joy and community where there was once only absence. Stephanie Hummer was 18 years old when she was murdered in March 1994. Her killer walked free for 12 years, not because investigators failed, not because evidence was mishandled, not because the system didn't care, but because the technological and legal infrastructure necessary to connect a DNA profile to a name simply didn't exist yet. A single legislative decision in 2005 changed everything. A law requiring DNA collection from all convicted felons, regardless of offense type, regardless of whether the crime involved violence, created the database breadth necessary to finally identify Jonathan Gravely. His conviction for failure to pay child support, seemingly unrelated to violence of any kind, became the administrative trigger that solved a brutal rape and murder cold case. The Hummer case stands as definitive proof that forensic databases work, that expanding DNA collection can solve seemingly unsolvable crimes, and that justice, even when delayed by more than a decade, is still worth pursuing. It validates the policy argument that universal felony DNA collection dramatically enhances public safety and law enforcement effectiveness in ways that targeted collection cannot match. But it also reminds us that justice comes with costs that verdicts and sentences can't fully address. For Stephanie's family, the conviction brought relief that the killer was finally identified and held accountable. But it couldn't restore the 13.5 years they spent without answers. It couldn't bring Sue Hummer back to see the parole hearing that her husband will have to face. It couldn't prevent the systemic imposition of recurring trauma that comes with life sentences with parole eligibility. April 2033 approaches. In a few years, Jonathan Gravely will sit before the Ohio Parole Board for the first time. Stephanie's family will be there, presenting victim impact statements, arguing for his continued incarceration, reliving the worst day of their lives because the system requires them to participate in this process. And that tree still grows in the park. Children still play beneath its branches. The community that was shattered by Stephanie's death found ways to heal and strengthen itself, even as the legal case remained unresolved for over a decade. This is the power and the price of cold case justice. This is what happens when forensic science and legislative policy intersect with human tragedy. This is the legacy of Stephanie Hummer, a case that changed how we think about DNA databases, a murder that catalyzed genuine community reform, and a family that transformed their grief into something that serves others while still carrying an unbearable burden. The case is closed, but the story continues.